please welcome Mr. James Cunningham, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction and the project lead. Can you hear me, James?
Yes, sir, I can.
That is fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. The audience is here in Vicenza or waiting to hear from you, so please, in your own time, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with some slides, but again, it's been a pleasure to work with the NATO Civilian Police Center of Excellence and with everybody here in the room. I probably have met at one point or another throughout our long-term career at SIGAR, looking at these important issues. I also want to express my hello to somebody in the audience from SIGAR, Anna Andrzejczyk, who is a key member of our team looking at these important issues and is representing our agency today in Vicenza. Okay, great. So again, what I'm going to focus on today is kind of improving the effectiveness and efficiency of international police assistance. And that is a core mission of our agency and our ability to come here today and to share what we have learned over the years. To kind of talk about our agency, first and foremost, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction was created in 2008 to provide independent and objective oversight of Afghanistan. And so I like to talk about who we are before I get into exactly the details, because it provides a unique perspective of why we're here today and why we're talking. Many international agencies do not have similar oversight functions within their government, but within the United States, we were created by Congress. Our Inspector General is appointed by the President, and we have responsibility and jurisdiction over all U.S. funding in Afghanistan. And so again, we can examine the effectiveness and efficiency of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Justice, Treasury, Commerce, any department that actually is actively involved in Afghanistan spend reconstruction dollars. We have the ability to do oversight and accountability of their actions. And what I mean by reconstruction is anything non-war fighting. So we're not housed in a single agency. And through that, we can actually provide whole of government lessons learned. We can look at how all the different agencies collectively operated within Afghanistan. In most countries and in most departments, any type of oversight is usually done and siloed within one department, within the military side, within the civilian side. But what SIGAR has is this wide jurisdiction and purview to be able to do the examination across the board. And for the first time ever, thanks to the NATO Stability Police Center of Excellence's leadership, we had created a joint report called Police in Conflict that was released earlier this year about the nature of police advising in Afghanistan. And we looked at the various elements of our mission, from the civilian-led mission to the military-led mission, from the U.S. side to the NATO side. And you'll see on the right-hand side us signing a memorandum of cooperation, which has been updated throughout the years. And then the one on the below picture is actually a joint assignment before COVID, where we actually were in Afghanistan together doing joint research, joint meetings, to really try to understand what happened in Afghanistan and what can we learn from that activity. So I guess the statement process is going to be, admit that you have a problem. This is key for all of us as we move forward, is understanding that there is a problem, especially in the realm of stability police and doing police advising in stabilization and conflict zones. And that is the fact that there's no single agency, organization, country that has both the capacity and the capability to do police assistance at the scale and size required in stabilization operations. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of people in the audience today that have unique capabilities to deploy and provide unique experiences for police assistance based off expertise that they have, but oftentimes they're limited in their capacity to deploy. In places like Afghanistan and Iraq, thousands of police advisors every month and every year needed to deploy to be able to be effective in their mission. And many of these organizations and agencies just do not have that capacity to do so. On the other hand, we have countries like the U.S., where our U.S. military definitely has the capacity to do things, but does not have the unique capabilities to be effective in the police assistance mission, which leads to the over-militarization of the forces, as we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. So we'll go right down to the cold, hard facts. An effective police is required to stabilize a country. That is just a given. We need to have effective police forces to be able to provide the rule of law and law enforcement to stabilize a country. Even the most developed countries, so you could have looked in the United States as early as the past couple of years, when your police force is not able to be effective in providing that rule of law and stabilization, you have instability that is ripe for exploitation by lawlessness officials or nefarious actors. So it is critically important in these post-conflict fragile states that we have the ability to provide this type of police assistance to develop an effective police force. Now, what's our issue is the UN found that within the first 6 to 12 weeks following the signing of a peace agreement, or within the first 6 to 12 weeks of a ceasefire, is the most critical for establishing this level of security and stability, and is the most critical for us to be able to have legitimacy of our intervention. However, what the UN also found is that it takes 9 to 12 months to actually establish a credible police force able to go into a fragile state and to actually stabilize it. And so if you look at that disconnect, you're looking at weeks compared to months. And what this would require is a lot of long-term advanced planning on how we're going to intervene in these countries, what kind of capabilities do we need, what kind of staffing do we need before we actually start intervening, so we're able to turn around the force that is required within the short timeline that is there. It's often considered the golden hour rule. The golden hour in the United States is how quickly can we pull off a wounded soldier to receive medical care to change between a life and death situation. It's the same thing for stabilization operations. That golden hour, that initial period where we can have the most success, we need to be able to staff and recruit police advisors with the required expertise at the required capacities to go forward. But the big problem is that many of our military organizations, from the United States combatant commands to SHAPE within NATO and other forces, the challenge is that they do not plan for police assistance. They focus on military operations, military intervention, and it's only until a year or two after the military operation started, they go, hey, listen, it would have been really great if we had police, or that we effectively create a police. And we're behind the curve. We're not there in mass. And then in Afghanistan, I believe the UN deployed 4 individuals within the first few years to actually do any type of police assistance. That's 4 people in the first couple of years where we could have had the most impact and the most success. But again, the problem is that these organizations responsible for the early years of intervention, early years of stabilization, are not preparing to send this type of capability going forward. And so how do we change that cycle? We're looking at places like Ukraine right now, which has tons of moral support, tons of public support for us to go in there and to help them stabilize potentially after the conflict with Russia is over. Has anybody discussed staffing? Has anybody discussed what kind of organizational model we're going to use? Has anybody talked about the fact that we had to completely reconstruct the Ukrainian police force only a few years ago based on their corruption and a whole bunch of issues? Has anybody thought about, do we need police advisors after stabilization? If so, in what numbers, what quantities? If it's going to take us 9 to 12 months to actually create an effective force to do stabilization, we should be thinking about these things today and thinking about them now and not after the fact where we start losing that golden hour in our ability to have the most impact and importance. The other thing that I would mention is that every country is unique. As we talk about when we go into a country like Afghanistan or other countries, every country is unique in how they do policing, from cultural to history to nature of criminality. But that also means that every country as they're intervening into another country is unique as well. So you have people like Germany who do police assistance through a civilian lens and is very opposed to any type of militarization, even if it's just a uniform of a police advisor. In the U.S., the legal structures for foreign police assistance is civilian also. We have Italy and the Great Carbonari have actually a unit that's deployable that can go out there and to do early interventions. Everybody has a different approach and a different model. There is no NATO standard for international police assistance. There's no NATO standard for how a police force should be organized. Everything is unique. And so not only do we have to encounter the host nation's culture, the host nation's history, we need to understand that all of us are coming with our own history and our own culture and how we're going to do so, which prevents us from ever having a comprehensive and common approach. And we often figure it out while we're there that there's a lot of things that needed to be deconflicted before we started to do an international peace intervention. Another thing I'll quickly mention is that doing nothing is destabilizing. As we notice in Afghanistan, not getting into that golden hour period, allowing a scrimmage for power over the police forces, which happens in almost every fragile state where people are competing for power, competing for influence, using the police force as a mechanism for political gains. If you're not intervening from day one, you're allowing that stuff to creep into the society, to creep into law and order. And by the time our police advisors come there, their chances of being able to reform that police force are sometimes lost or at least significantly harder. And so how do we make sure that in the early days, we're actually doing something? Because doing nothing, again, is allowing us to sit back and watch while we have actors inside of a country not doing the law enforcement and law and order in a way in which we hope they would. Because as I said, they see it as influence and political power. But doing the wrong thing is even more destabilizing. And so again, doing nothing may be destabilizing, doing the wrong thing can be more. And so we need to be very conscious of the fact that our actions have consequences. And if you look at the Balkans, for example, the civil versus common law principles, when we went into the Balkans, we actually in the United States implemented a police assistance mission that ran counter to actually how the Balkans criminal justice system and rule of law works. And so we started introducing cases that violated their own constitution, and all of these cases were being thrown out. So even though we did effective prosecutions, and even though we did effective law enforcement operations in our mind against some of the most nefarious actors, by the time they went through the court system, they weren't able to be prosecuted because we, again, did not understand their society, their systems, and we try to superimpose ours, which was, again, very destabilizing. And what's the result? Since World War II, nearly half of all societies recovering from one civil war have relapsed within 5 years, and 1/5 have relapsed within 1 year. Without us being able to effectively understand how to do this mission effectively, countries are relapsing at a very rapid rate. How do we prevent the next intervention that we're going into from not suffering from the same issue of going back into a civil war or having destabilization because they do not have rule of law or an effective criminal justice system? So really quickly, just kind of organizing our mission for success, how can we do better? What are some of the lessons we learned? What are some of the things we can take away from Afghanistan? As I talked about, first and foremost, develop a common operating picture with all local and international stakeholders. Understanding what is our objectives, what do we seek to do in that country, what do we want to achieve, how are we approaching this problem, where internally are our fracture points, where externally with our host nation partner are we going to run into some significant issues, what is it that we're seeking to achieve, and coming up with that common operating picture. Yes, the Germans, the United States, the Italians, the Romanians, everybody may have a different approach, but as long as we have the same objectives, the same goals, and we recognize how we're performing on those objectives and goals, we'll have more success. And with that, we need to have a framework that clearly identifies activities and responsibilities. Who's going to be responsible for what, to make sure that we're not doing duplication of work, but we're also not running counter in the way in which we're approaching our work in the police assistance environment. How do we ensure that the activities and programs that we're putting in place in the western part of the country align with what's being put in place in the eastern part of the country? You know, this requires a lot of thinking, it requires a lot of discussion, it requires a lot of deconfliction, it requires a level of management that we just did not have in Afghanistan. We also need to analyze all methods of host nation justice in their criminal justice system. How do they do rule of law? How do they do justice in their system? You look at places like Afghanistan, the informal justice system, which again, the U.S. and the international community largely did not support because it was not a formal mechanism that we prefer, is one that the locals turn to regularly. It was one that the Taliban gained inroads significantly into, and one that we were not able to have any type of positive impact going forward. We often ignored those type of informal mechanism systems and tried to superimpose a formal justice system, which in local parts of society in Afghanistan and elsewhere are sometimes not welcomed because they view that as a way of government imposition, and if the government is corrupt, a way of having corruption seep into their society. Police assistance strategies must be socialized and coordinated with other criminal justice components. And that is a big issue that we had in Afghanistan. It's a big issue I see elsewhere, is that the police assistance component, developing capabilities and capacities within the police, is often done in a silo and is not coordinated with prison reform, not done with prosecutorial development, not done with justice reform. It's not done in connection with any of those things. We asked many police advisors in Afghanistan, were they aware of certain new rules and laws that were being passed in the criminal justice environment that would impact the way in which police are doing their activities in Afghanistan? And most of the time the answer was no. They did not know about these things because the justice sector development was very different from the police sector development. So how do we ensure that there is overlap and that we're working as a unified force in the realm of criminal justice and the realm of law enforcement? Another thing is we must include the ability to do embedded long-term partnerships with our foreign nation. And that's a big problem that we have within the NATO environment, we have within the U.S., is that we send out advisors for 6 months, 12 months, then we bring them back home. And then we do not engage again, or we engage with different partners, or we engage in a different approach. How do we do this embedded long-term mentoring and advising? How do we ensure that the right people with the right capabilities, with the right expertise, with the right experience is partnering with those forces on a long-term basis, even if it means constant rotations in and out of country, even if it means virtual engagements in addition to the in-person engagements, but how do we maintain that embedded long-term persistent relationship with the police forces in that foreign country? The best models to develop capacity and capability in the security sector are those that have long-term embedded international advisors and support there over a long period of time. Short deployments, periodic deployments are just not as successful. And then again, we need to ensure that everybody that's deploying has those technical capabilities, professional experience, and tailored training. We need to make sure we're sending the people that have that capability to not only teach police assistance, but to teach it in the environment in which that host nation is occupying. And what I mean by that is we used to send over in the U.S. government pilots to be police advisors in Afghanistan, medics to be police advisors in Afghanistan, people who had no idea how to do policing at all. We were sending over to advise the police in Afghanistan. That mismatch had disastrous impacts. We were unable to develop a core capability because the advisors did not have that experience and expertise to do so. And then lastly, we have to worry about mirror imaging and capacity substitution challenges. The U.S., Italy, the United Kingdom, and many other countries went into Afghanistan and started forcing them to draft criminal justice laws that we thought were best for them based off of the ways in which we did criminal justice in our countries. And we called it summertime rulemaking. Basically, every summer, new advisors would go over and they'd just draft new laws and tell the Afghans to adopt it, whether it violated a previous law in Afghanistan, whether it was effective, whether it had the long-term support of the country. We just kind of imposed our will on them because we thought these laws were the most successful in our countries, so it should work for them. And so that's kind of how we approached the problem. And again, we substituted our capacity, mirror imaged ourselves, and the Afghans were left having to deal with what we created after we withdrew. Real quick, I won't go into depth on most of this, but again, we want to focus on the outcomes, not the inputs and outputs. A lot of time we focus on the inputs and outputs and not the outcomes of how we're achieving our goals. How many advisors are we sending out there is a measurement of success. How many training programs is a measurement of success. How many people graduated our program is a measurement of success. Those things are inputs, those things are outputs, those things are not measuring success. What's measuring success is the activities in which we're doing, accomplishing or meeting the objectives in which we set forward. Is the training, are the advisors, are the programs actually turning the Afghan police or turning another country's police force into an effective, legitimate, trusted entity that the locals are welcoming and that they're providing security, stability, and rule of law to the society? Is that happening? Are we meeting those objectives? Are we meeting those goals? That is the ultimate objective for our mission, but we oftentimes do not measure our progress along the outcomes of that objective, but more about what we're doing, because what we're doing is easy to measure. I can tell you how many people went through my training program, but I can't tell you how many of those people are actually providing effective rule of law. We graduated 20 out of our training program. We consider that measurement of success, but what if those 20 are going into society and abusing society, being predatory against society? We're counting it as a success because we're doing more training. In reality, they're being actually more of a destabilizing force than a stabilizing force. And then again, we need to ensure that our training and reforms outlast international police assistance mission. Our goal is to work ourselves kind of out of a job. We need to create systems, processes that allow the host nation to adopt them, to trust them, to believe in them, to recognize that they're going to have a positive impact on their society, to recognize, to have society realize the positive impacts that that training is going to have on their society. And how do you do that? And that's by building a social contract between the international advisors, the host nation government and the police themselves, saying this is the process in which we're going to develop a police force. Here is what you can expect from that police force, and here are the objectives and outcomes that you should be monitoring to be effective in the future. And so again, we need to be able to have it being done, by within through that host nation, but creating structures, creating systems, creating laws that will outlast our engagement. You can just look in Afghanistan today. They have not changed the Constitution. They have not really changed the rule of law. They actually pointed to the Constitution recently in a recent meeting saying that nothing should be violating Sharia. And the problem is that we didn't put in structures in place that had the law enforcement and had the rule of law outlast us. And so now we're looking at the disastrous impacts of the fact that Taliban are now in charge of rule of law and are now using that to, again, have an imposition on society. And lastly, I will just conclude with a quote from Albert Einstein. It's one that we kind of live and die by. The only mistake in life is the lesson not learned. We must learn. Right now, many of us put out lessons, identified reports. We're identifying the critical issues in certain missions and portions of society, our stabilization operations, how we're doing police assistance. We all are coming up with lessons. We all are identifying the challenges, but are we really learning from those lessons? Our leadership actually implementing reforms into our process? Is our political leadership changing the way we approach this problem? Is NATO learning that Afghanistan can't happen again? I would argue they're not. We still do not have a signed concept for stability policing. We still do not have a common framework for how to do policing in the future. We still do not have a common agreement on how we're going to achieve our goals. Again, all of these things that we are mentioning as far as deficits within Afghanistan, they remain deficits today. And we need to move from having conferences in which we discuss these lessons, where we write about these lessons, where we discuss these lessons, and actually having our leaders realize that we need to change our programmatic approach, we need to change our strategies, and we need to change how we engage in our foreign police assistance missions in the future. And with that, I appreciate everyone's time today. I look forward to future questions and answering. And thank you, NATO Stability Police Center of Excellence, for the ability to speak here today.
James.